Before they wore the armor that the whole galaxy learned to fear, the Mandalorians were not even a culture. They were a single species, and their story starts with loss instead of victory. These first Mandalorians were called the Tong. They were tall and gray-skinned beings who looked a little like apes that had learned to stand up and fight. They stood almost 2 meters high. They carried bright yellow eyes, and a deep fighting spirit ran through everything they did. Here is the part that surprises most people. The Tong did not come from some far-off rock on the edge of the galaxy. They came from Coruscant, the very same world that would one day sit at the center of the entire Republic. This was long before the Republic ever existed. Back then, Coruscant was home to the Tong, and it was also home to 13 separate human nations who had joined together into one large group. That group was known as the Battalions of Gel. The Tong and the Gel did not get along, and the fighting between them dragged on for generations. It shaped both sides down to the core. The Tong were already warriors by nature, and this long struggle hardened that nature into the heart of who they were. Then nature itself stepped in and changed the whole story. A massive volcano went off and tore through the human Gel. The eruption threw so much ash into the sky that it blocked out the sun across the entire planet. Coruscant sat in darkness for 2 full years. You would think that would hand the Tong an easy victory, and for a moment it truly looked that way. In that darkened world, the Tong gave themselves a new name. They began calling themselves the Da Werda Verda, which means the Warriors of the Shadow. That new name carried real meaning for them. It became the heart of a famous Mandalorian war poem that warriors would recite for thousands of years afterward. But the Shadow did not save them. Even after the volcano wrecked their enemies, the Tong still ended up on the losing side. The human Gel slowly recovered, rebuilt their strength, and drove the Tong off Coruscant for good. This was the start of a long exile from the world they had always called home. Now the Tong had to find somewhere new to go. They fled to a planet out on the outer rim called Rune, and they stayed there for roughly 1,000 years. Through all that time, they held tight to their warrior ways, and they held on to something else as well. They carried a lasting bitterness toward the humans who had taken their homeworld away from them. There was also a smaller group that split off, a faction of female Tong who followed a more religious path known as the Warriors of Shadow, headed in a completely different direction toward the unknown regions. Their beliefs would later help shape a dark side group called the Sorcerers of Rand. It was a strange branch growing off the same family tree that gave us the Mandalorians. After all those centuries on Rune, one figure finally pulled the scattered Tong back together. A single warlord rose up, united his people, and got them ready to head out into the galaxy once again. He took a title that would echo through the rest of their history. He called himself Mandalore the First. Around 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, Mandalore the First led the Tong to a brand new world far out in the Outer Rim. It was a green planet full of many different landscapes. No other intelligent species lived there, but the place was far from empty. It was ruled by enormous beasts that towered over everything around them. The Tong took that world and made it their own. They renamed it Mandayaim, which means home of the Mandalore. Over time, that name got smoothed out in everyday speech and became Mandalore, named in honor of the conqueror himself. The Tong also gave themselves a fresh name. They became the Mandalorians, or, in their own tongue, the Mando-Ad, which means the sons and daughters of Mandalore. With that one choice, they tied themselves forever to both their leader and their new home. The greatest danger on this world were the mythosaurs. These were giant beasts shaped a bit like dragons, and their sheer size made Mandalore one of the hardest planets anyone could ever hope to settle. Mandalore the First did not shy away from them. He hunted these creatures down himself and brought the wild land under control, which proved that a Mandalorian warrior could stand against even the largest predators in the galaxy. From one of these fallen beasts, he made something that would last forever. He took the sternum bone from the creature and carved the very first mask of Mandalore, shaping it after the face of his own Tong people. From that day forward, the mythosaur skull became the lasting symbol of the entire Mandalorian people. They stamped it onto their banners and their armor. For thousands of years, it would also ride into battle on their warships, standing as a mark of their power and their will to conquer. Mandalore the First was the first being ever to wear that mask. He was also the first to carry the title Mandalore, a word that means sole ruler. As his fame spread, the mask itself turned into the physical sign of leadership. Whoever wore it held command over all the clans, and this tradition would outlive the Tong species itself. In the earliest days, only a Tong could become Mandalore by taking up the mask of a fallen leader. But as the Mandalorians began bringing other peoples into their ranks, that old rule slowly faded away. For these warriors, fighting was never just a job. It was something much closer to a religion. Combat carried real spiritual weight for them, and the way they spread their rule was treated like a holy mission. Their language, called Mando'a, held all of this inside its very words. In that language, there was barely a line separating the idea of a warrior from the idea of a citizen, and almost no line at all between a citizen and a believer. To be Mandalorian meant that you were a soldier. A few key items came out of these early days. The Beskar was their traditional curved sword, built from an old Tong design that survived all the way from their time on Coruscant and Rune. They also prized a special ore mined inside their own territory called Mandalorian iron, better known as Beskar. This metal was almost impossible to break, and it could be forged into armor and blades strong enough to hold their own against a lightsaber. That material became the foundation of the fearsome reputation they would carry for ages. All of these pieces came together into the full-body armor that the Mandalorians would wear for the rest of their history. A sealed helmet covered the face. A jetpack gave them the power of flight, and the suit itself came loaded with weapons of its own. On top of all that, they wore a warrior code just as openly as the plates across their chest. Their founding story was one of exile and loss under a darkened sky, and of taking a world filled with monsters. All of it gave them a culture built on toughness and a deep desire for payback. Above all, it gave them a flat refusal to ever be ruled by anyone else. And they never forgot Coruscant. The memory of being driven off their first home would come roaring back thousands of years later when the clans struck at the very heart of the Republic during the Great Sith War. By the end of this first chapter, the Mandalorians had gone from a beaten and exiled people into one united warrior nation. They were armed and masked, and they were hungry for whatever came next. Most armies fight because someone forces them to. The Mandalorian Crusaders fought because they believed battle was a sacred calling. Once Mandalore belonged to them, and the Tong had remade themselves into a brand new people, they could have settled down and enjoyed the peace they had earned. That was never going to happen. Their roaming nature and their love of battle pushed them right back out into the stars, and they began swallowing up new territory through one campaign after another. Mandalore the First had built the warrior tradition, but the great conquering army that defined this age took shape under the leader who came after him. He was remembered as Mandalore the Conqueror, and he took loose bands of clans and forged them into a fighting machine that could reach across the galaxy. Under him, these warriors became known as the Mandalorian Crusaders. To the Crusaders, fighting was not a tool, it was their faith. Their campaigns were carried out like holy missions, and the value of any single Mandalorian came down to how brave they were in a fight and how much land they could conquer. Just as important was their willingness to give their life whenever the moment called for it. The Crusaders rolled across the sectors near their home, taking control of one world after another. Some of the peoples in their path were forced to bow. Others were erased from the galaxy entirely, either because they stood in the way or because they had technology worth taking. The Fenelar were one of these lost peoples. So were the Quarrens and the Telonians. And then there was one more name on that grim list, a people called the Basiliskans, who turned out to matter more than all the rest. The reason the Basiliskans mattered so much was what the Mandalorians took from their world. They seized the Basilisk war droids, enormous war mounts made of a living metal that gave them a strange, half-aware mind of their own. These machines could fight just as easily in the open sky as they could in the emptiness of space. A Basilisk war droid was a flying, clawed beast of a vehicle, and a single Mandalorian could ride one straight into a fight, breaking apart enemy formations and even striking targets in orbit above a planet. A warrior already wrapped in Beskar armor could now sit on top of one of these living engines. Against worlds with simple weapons or weak defenses, the Crusaders became almost impossible to stop. This was the moment their name turned into a legend, the most feared fighting force of the entire age. Not everyone folded, though. The first people who truly stood toe-to-toe with them were the Mandalorian giants, who lived on the nearby world of Mandalia. Their counterattack was so fierce and so impressive that the Crusaders did something they rarely did. Rather than erasing them, the Mandalorians offered them respect. In time, the Mandalorian giants were folded into Mandalorian culture instead of being destroyed, and they became one of the earliest examples of a habit that would define this people for thousands of years. They would conquer the weak, but they would honor the strong, and any warrior good enough to earn it could be welcomed into the fold. That single approach is a big reason the culture managed to outlive the Tong themselves. All of this conquest needed rules, and this era gave the Mandalorians their first real ones. They created the ancient canons of honor, an early set of laws and traditions covering how a warrior should behave and how their leaders should rule. It also laid out the duties each Mandalorian owed to their clan and to their Mandalore. Beneath everything sat a deeper foundation that would later be written down as the Resol Nare, a Mandoa word meaning the 6 actions. These were the things that made a person truly Mandalorian. The first was to wear the armor. The second was to speak the language. A Mandalorian also had to be ready to defend themselves and their family at any moment. On top of that, they were expected to raise their children in the old ways and to give back to the well-being of their clan. The final action tied all of it together, because whenever the Mandalore sent out the call, every Mandalorian was bound to answer. The way they organized themselves flowed from this same thinking. Instead of building nations the way most worlds did, the Mandalorians lived in clans. A clan was basically one large warrior family, and many clans together formed bigger groups called houses. Above all of them stood the Mandalore, the single leader they all answered to. What decided that title was the mask itself. Any Mandalorian strong enough to claim the mask of Mandalore and place it on their own head took command of everyone, usually by proving they were the strongest or by being the rightful heir to it. For these centuries, the Mandalorians stayed a wandering people who lived for conquest. Their fleets and their basilisk riders ranged far across the outer and mid-rim, going wherever they could win treasure and glory or find an enemy worth their time. They built a terrifying reputation long before the Galactic Republic was even strong enough to reach those distant regions. The mythosaur skull marked everything they owned, and just the sight of a Mandalorian force closing in was enough to fill worlds with dread, even ones that had only ever heard the stories. That worship of battle came with a heavy price, though. Constant fighting slowly thinned their own ranks, because a culture that celebrates falling in combat will always lose its finest warriors over time. The Tong in particular began a long, quiet decline across these centuries of endless war, and that slow shrinking would one day help bring about the end of the founding species altogether. Even so, the culture itself only grew richer. They built up a deep tradition of war poetry and spoken history that kept the memory of fallen warriors and past leaders alive for generations. The old battle chant of the Da Werda Verda, born back on Coruscant, lived on through all of this, recited in a steady rhythm to bind warriors together right before they fought. By the time the Galactic Republic had grown into a real galactic power, the Mandalorians were already an ancient and established military people sitting on its edge. They were feared and respected, and they had absolutely no interest in bowing to anyone. They cared nothing for the politics of the Republic or for its many trade deals. The growing reach of the Jedi Order meant just as little to them. Their loyalty belonged to conquest and to their clan. Above all, it belonged to their Mandalore. That fierce independence put them on a path that would crash directly into both the Republic and the Jedi, the two powers that were slowly bringing order to the rest of the galaxy. There was one more thing pulling them toward that collision. The Crusaders craved worthy enemies, and no enemy promised a greater challenge than those who could use the Force. To a Mandalorian, getting the better of a Force user was the ultimate proof of their skill. That hunger for the strongest possible opponents would eventually drag them into the terrible wars of the Old Republic, starting with the rise of a fallen Jedi who turned to the dark side and called himself a Sith. By the time that storm arrived, the Mandalorians were led by a warlord whose chosen name announced that he could never be beaten. He was Mandalore the Indomitable, and the day he crossed paths with the Sith, the fate of his entire people would change forever. The Mandalorians had spent thousands of years forcing other worlds to their knees. Their leader was about to find out exactly what that felt like from the other side. Around 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the man at the head of the clans was Mandalore the Indomitable. His name said everything about him because he truly believed that nothing in the galaxy could ever beat him. For a long stretch of time, nobody gave him a reason to think any differently. While he searched the stars for his next great fight, the rest of the galaxy was being torn apart by something far darker. Two members of the Jedi Order had turned their backs on everything they once stood for. Their names were Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma. They gave themselves over to the dark side, took up the title of Sith, and set off a galaxy-spanning conflict that history would remember as the Great Sith War. For a warrior who lived to test himself against the strongest enemies he could find, this was the chance of a lifetime. Mandalore the Indomitable set his eyes on the Empress Teta system, which was held by a dark side group known as the Krath cult. He led his warriors in a string of careful raids, each one meant to poke at the Krath and measure just how strong their defenses really were. The raids stayed quiet enough until the Mandalorians went after a Krath carbonite smelting station and brought it down completely. That finally got noticed. Word reached Ulic Qel-Droma, who by now had risen to become one of the leading commanders on the Sith side. Qel-Droma reached out to the Mandalorians directly, and his message was short: "Surrender or be destroyed." Mandalore the Indomitable laughed it off. Rather than bow to a threat, he made an offer of his own. He challenged Qel-Droma to face him one-on-one, a Sith Lord against the leader of the Mandalorians, and let a single fight decide the whole thing. Both leaders brought their armies to a world deep in the core of the galaxy called Qua. They met on a place known as the Plains of Harkul, where the Mandalorians had already taken control and set up their camps. Mandalore knew he was facing someone who could touch the Force, so he set some careful terms for the fight. The duel would happen high up in the air, on a web of chains linked together above the ground. He would be allowed to ride his own customized basilisk mount into the battle, while Qel-Droma would have to fight on his own 2 feet with no mount at all. Qel-Droma agreed, but he added one condition that raised the stakes higher than anyone expected. If he came out on top, then Mandalore and his entire army would swear themselves to him and serve in his forces until the war was over. So the two of them fought, hanging above the world on those swinging chains. Early on, Qel-Droma destroyed the war Mount Mandalore was riding, which dragged the fight down into a far more even contest between the two men. And then something happened that the Mandalorians had not seen in living memory. This time, their own leader had lost. For the first time anyone could remember, a Mandalore had been beaten face to face in single combat. A warrior culture built on keeping its word does not break a deal, no matter how bitter it tastes. Mandalore the Indomitable held up his side of the bargain. He bent the knee, handing himself and all of his warriors over to Ulic Qel-Droma, and through him to Qel-Droma's own master, the Sith Lord Exar Kun. It is hard to put into words how strange this moment was for the Mandalorians. Here was a people who treated conquest almost like a god, now taking orders from an outsider. Plenty of the clans hated it. They felt no pride at all in spending their strength on a fight that belonged to someone else. Still, they were warriors to the core, and they fought with everything they had. Under Qel-Droma's command, the Mandalorians swept across Republic space and laid waste to one world after another. Foerost and Iridonia were among the first to feel their fury. The Abron system and the Thespias system suffered the same treatment. The Contruum system got swept up in it as well. Then came the campaign that carried the most weight of all. The Mandalorians took part in the Sith strike against Coruscant. For most armies, that would have been just another target on a map. For the descendants of the Tong, it was the world their ancestors had once been driven from. Now those same people were carrying the fight straight into the heart of the galaxy that had cast them out so long ago, and an old wound buried deep in their history was finally being answered. Mandalore the Indomitable did not only fight on the front lines, though. He got pulled into the messy politics of the Sith leadership as well. At one point, when Qel-Droma was believed to be either captured or gone, Mandalore joined other commanders in pushing back against a Krath sorceress named Alima Keto, who had handed herself power that the others did not think she had earned. One enemy from this war would end up mattering far more than the rest. The Mandalorians clashed with a feline warrior species called the Cathar, who fought back against them with ferocity. That fierce resistance planted a seed of bad feeling between the two peoples, a grudge that would one day grow into something truly terrible. As the war dragged on, the tide began to turn against the Sith. Exar Kun and Kel Droma started losing their grip, and the whole cause began falling to pieces. The Mandalorians were handed one last job, the invasion of the planet Onderon. The biggest decisions of the war, though, were being made somewhere else entirely. At a world called Ossus, Kel Droma was cut off from the Force and finally gave himself up, broken after his own brother fell at his hand. Meanwhile, the Mandalorians were stuck in a slow and grinding standoff down on Onderon, the kind of fight that neither side could finish in a hurry. Everything shifted when fresh Republic forces arrived in the skies above Onderon. All at once, the Mandalorians were the ones on the back foot. Mandalore the Indomitable called for a retreat and pulled his warriors toward one of the planet's jungle moons, a wild place called Djarin, hoping the thick wilderness would help them lose the enemies chasing them down. Djarin was no safe haven. It was a savage moon crawling with deadly creatures. As Mandalore made his way down through the atmosphere, his mount was shot out of the sky, and he was forced into a hard crash landing in the jungle below. Stranded and alone among the moon's vicious animals, the great warlord met his end there. He was brought down by the wild moon itself, a quiet and lonely finish for a man whose name had once meant he could never be conquered. When the surviving Mandalorians finally shook off their pursuers and pulled themselves back together on Djarin, a few of them went searching the jungle for their lost leader. They never found him. One warrior came across the only thing left behind, the mask of Mandalore, caught and tangled in a patch of growth. By the tradition these warriors had followed since the very beginning, the one who found the mask lifted it and set it onto his own head. In that single moment, he became the new leader of every Mandalorian alive, and he took the name Mandalore the Ultimate. The Great Sith War ended in complete defeat for the Sith and everyone who had stood beside them. The Mandalorians had backed the losing side. They had lost their leader, and they came out of the whole ordeal scattered and weakened, carrying a heavy bitterness with them. That wound went deeper than just losing. A lot of Mandalorians felt they had been used. They had spent the lives of their own warriors fighting for Kel Droma, and all it earned them was shame in place of the glory they had been promised. The anger ran so hot that a group of clans broke away and declared that they had no true leader at all. The way they saw it, the old Mandalore had basically handed the title over to Kel Droma the moment he surrendered, so the office no longer meant anything. These bitter clans would later help spark a movement to completely reshape what it meant to be a Mandalorian. On top of all of that, the war had badly thinned their ranks once again. The slow fading of the Tong sped up even further, and the new leader was left holding a broken nation that needed to be rebuilt almost from nothing. That new leader was Mandalore the Ultimate. He took charge of a people who were wounded but still unbeaten in spirit. And over the next 20 years or so, he would change them into something the galaxy had never come across before. Under him, the Mandalorians would grow into a reformed fighting force made up of many different species, strong enough and bold enough to take on the entire Republic all on their own. There is a hidden danger in any culture that lives for battle. Given enough time, it slowly runs out of the very warriors it leans on to survive. This was the exact problem Mandalore the Ultimate faced when he took charge. The Tong had been shrinking for ages, and after everything the Great Sith War had cost them, there were not enough of the original people left to keep their fighting forces at full strength. So over almost 20 years, he led the surviving clans back to their old life of moving from world to world and quietly went to work rebuilding them across the Outer Rim. Then he made a choice that changed his people forever. Up to this point, the Mandalorians had only ever welcomed the odd worthy fighter from a beaten enemy. Mandalore the Ultimate flung the doors wide open. He declared that anyone from any species in the galaxy could become a true Mandalorian, as long as they were willing to take up the culture and live by the creed. This was a huge turning point. In a single decision, the Mandalorians stopped being one species and became something defined by what you believed and how you fought, instead of where you happened to be born. It was this exact change that allowed the Mandalorian way to live on even as the Tong kept fading toward their end. These newly reformed warriors took on a name of their own. They became the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders. You could spot them right away. Their armor came in matching sets, sorted by color, and they answered to a strict and orderly chain of command. On top of that, they carried a renewed hunger for conquest, fiercer than anything that had come before. The man who turned this vision into a real fighting force was Cassius Fett. This is the first time the Fett name enters our story, and it would go on to become one of the most famous names in the entire galaxy. Cassius was a field commander with a brilliant and cold mind for war, and his skill made him one of the most feared Mandalorians of his time. He designed much of how the Neo-Crusaders fought and what they fought with, shaping them into a disciplined, uniform army that would soon tear through Republic fleets along the eastern side of the galaxy. Mandalore the Ultimate was willing to chase any edge he could find. Less than 10 years after the Great Sith War, he was approached by a Zeltron scientist named Antos Wyrick. Wyrick had once studied under the previous leader, and now he came forward with an unsettling idea. He had gotten his hands on a genetic sample from an Arcanian Jedi master called Arca Jeth, who happened to have been Ulic Qel-Droma's old teacher. With it, Wyrick claimed he could create Force-sensitive children, basically building a Mandalorian answer to the Jedi. Mandalore agreed to let him try. Wyrick set up a secret operation called the New Generation Project on a planet named Osadia, working to grow Force-sensitive Mandalorian soldiers from Arcanian offshoot parents. The project never produced the army of Force users he had promised. Still, it told you everything about Mandalore the Ultimate. He would reach for absolutely any advantage in the war he was already preparing to wage against the Republic. And here is where the story takes a turn that even the Mandalorians never saw coming. They believed every step they took toward war was their own idea. But that was not the truth at all. Far away in the unknown regions, a rebuilt true Sith Empire was working in the shadows, quietly pulling the strings on Mandalore the Ultimate himself. The Sith were nudging the clans toward a massive war on purpose, hoping to weaken the Republic from the inside. This is the part that makes the whole thing so tragic. The coming Mandalorian Wars were, at their very root, a setup. The Sith engineered the entire conflict to wear down both the Mandalorians and the Republic at the same time, clearing the path for an invasion of their own somewhere down the line. But Mandalore the Ultimate had no clue. Fully convinced he was acting on his own free will, he began poking at the Republic to see how it would respond. He sent raids across the Outer Rim, swallowing one system after another along the eastern edge of the galaxy. For more than 10 years, he kept this up without ever drawing a full response. He was building a real empire of conquered worlds, while the Republic Senate sat back and waved the whole thing off as nothing more than distant trouble on the border. Then his warriors came for Cathar. This was the homeworld of that feline warrior species the Mandalorians had clashed with back during the Great Sith War. The bad feeling from that old fight had never gone away, and now Mandalore the Ultimate's forces went after the Cathar to settle the score for good. The Cathar were not part of the Republic, which meant that when the Mandalorians arrived, they had to face it completely on their own with no help coming from anyone. Cassius Fett led the attack himself, and it was carefully and coldly planned. First, the fleet pounded the planet from orbit, knocking out the Cathar ability to call for help and wrecking their docking stations in space. Then the ground forces and basilisk riders came down on top of them. What followed was one of the darkest things the Mandalorians ever did. Cassius was not interested in just winning. He wanted the Cathar gone as a people, erased from the galaxy entirely. In the final stage of it all, he drove the last of the Cathar toward the ocean, set on finishing off the whole species. One Mandalorian woman could not stomach what was happening. She spoke up against Cassius, telling him the Cathar were already beaten and that what he was doing went against everything their honor stood for. Cassius brushed her aside. He told her the campaign had only ever been about revenge. And in the end, she shared the same fate as the very people she had tried to protect. The Battle of Cathar pushed the species right to the edge of vanishing forever. It stands as one of the ugliest stains in all of Mandalorian history. The kind of act that later, more honorable Mandalorians would look back on with deep shame. That horror also set something much bigger in motion. Word of what had happened on Cathar spread, and it reached the ears of a group of young, idealistic Jedi. Their leader was a gifted and charismatic figure named Revan. To Revan and his followers, it was unthinkable that the Republic would just sit on its hands while the Mandalorians wiped entire worlds off the map. These Jedi came to be known as the Revengists. They pushed back hard against their own cautious Jedi Council and against the Senate, demanding that someone finally stand up to the Mandalorians. In time, they began gathering volunteers who were ready to take up arms and fight in the Republic's defense. Meanwhile, Mandalore the Ultimate had built up an enormous and well-drilled Neo-Crusader army. He was certain the Republic had grown too big and too slow to put up any real fight, a soft giant that had long since lost its edge. His reformed Mandalorians were a completely different beast from the rough raiding bands of the old days. They marched in organized armies and sailed in advanced warships. They rode their basilisk war droids into battle, and all of it answered to one single chain of command. By taking in so many different peoples and drilling iron discipline into all of them, Mandalore the Ultimate had built the most dangerous version of the Mandalorians the galaxy had ever seen. For the first time, they stood as a true match for the military strength of the Republic itself. An open invasion of Republic space was now only a matter of time. And when that invasion finally came, it would set off a 16-year storm that would reshape the entire galaxy and turn the name Revan into a legend. The cruelest part of all of this is that Mandalore the Ultimate truly believed he was leading his people into their greatest age of glory. In reality, he was a pawn in someone else's game, marching the Mandalorians straight toward the worst defeat they would ever suffer. The pieces were now in place for the Mandalorian Wars, the conflict that would finally answer one simple question. Could the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy actually conquer the Republic? Or had they at last met a mind every bit as ruthless and brilliant as any Mandalore who came before them? For 16 long years, the galaxy would be set on fire by a war that had been rigged from the very beginning, and the one chosen to win it would lose a piece of himself in the process. Historians usually count the Mandalorian Wars as beginning around 3,976 years before the Battle of Yavin. The Mandalorians swept across the eastern edge of the galaxy, taking one system after another. Their disciplined forces rolled right over local defenses wherever they went. Even with open war breaking out, the Republic was painfully slow to throw its full strength into stopping them. The Jedi were just as hesitant, but for a very different reason. The Jedi Council could feel something dark lurking behind the whole conflict, and it left them deeply uneasy. So they urged caution and refused to officially send the order to war, worried they were walking straight into a trap. That caution did not sit right with Revan. He had studied the Mandalorian advance closely, and he reached a hard conclusion. If nobody acted, countless worlds were going to fall. So he ignored the council and threw himself into the fight, bringing his revanchist followers along with him. At his side was his closest friend, a fellow Jedi named Malak. Together, the two of them led wave after wave of Jedi volunteers into battle. Their presence lit a fire under the Republic's sagging spirits and finally gave its forces the kind of leadership the regular military had been missing. For a while, though, none of that seemed to matter. Under Mandalore the Ultimate and the brilliant Cassius Fett, the Neo-Crusaders piled up one crushing win after another. They drove deep into Republic territory and grabbed up world after important world. One of their biggest prizes was Taris, a sprawling planet completely covered in city and one of the major trading hubs out in the Outer Rim. With Taris in their grip, the Mandalorians threatened to push even further inward toward the core, and fear spread through the Republic like wildfire. Then Revan started changing the math. He turned out to be every bit the equal of any Mandalore when it came to strategy. He buried himself in the study of how the Mandalorians fought, and he worked out how to use their own habits against them. Their aggression and their predictability, the very things that made them so frightening, became cracks in their armor once Revan knew where to push. His victories began stacking up. He won back lost ground and freed captured worlds one by one. A few years into the war, the Republic's leader, Supreme Chancellor Tol Kressa, handed Revan command of the entire war effort and named him Supreme Commander. One of his proudest moments came when he took back Taris itself, breaking the Mandalorian hold on the city world. It was a powerful sign, both for what it meant on the map and for what it meant in people's hearts. The Republic could do far more than just slow the Mandalorians down. It could actually push them back. The Mandalorians did not fold easily, of course. Cassius Fett kept on winning battles even as the larger war slipped away, scoring a victory at a place called Jaga's Cluster. But the losses were piling up too, and the Mandalorians took a crushing defeat at the world of Althea. Behind all of these victories, though, something was quietly going wrong inside Revan and Malak. The deeper they sank into the war, the more the dark side crept into them. Part of it came from old Sith ruins scattered across the worlds they fought over, places that gave off a corrupting pull. The rest came from the war itself, from all the cold and ugly choices a person has to make to win a fight that big. The decisions Revan made to come out on top were so harsh that they deeply troubled the very Jedi Council that had refused to stand beside him. It was during this stretch that Revan pieced together the bigger picture. He realized the Mandalorian invasion had never truly been the main threat. It was bait, one part of a much larger plan being run by a hidden enemy from the shadows. From that moment on, Revan set himself a far greater goal. He would do more than beat the Mandalorians. He would track down and face whatever was secretly pulling their strings. The Mandalorians kept fighting with all the fierceness and honor they were known for, but it was no longer enough. Revan's relentless campaign slowly ground them down, taking back system after system and cutting Mandalore the Ultimate's main army off from any support. By the later years of the war, Revan had shoved them far back and reclaimed key ground, including the Liana system. Mandalore's forces were now stretched too thin and dangerously exposed. By this point, the whole war had boiled down to a contest between two brilliant minds. On one side stood Revan, on the other stood Mandalore, the Ultimate. Each of them was hunting for that one decisive battle that could break the other and finish everything in a single stroke. Mandalore the Ultimate still trusted in his Neo-Crusaders to win any straight-up fight, so he went looking for a grand showdown, one enormous clash that would destroy the Republic fleet and reverse all of his recent losses. Revan, on the other hand, had zero interest in a fair fight. In secret, he had been building a trap, along with a weapon so powerful it could end the war in a single, devastating moment. The spot he picked for the trap was a quiet farming world called Malachor 5. On the surface, it looked completely harmless, but Malachor 5 was hiding a dangerous secret. It sat right on top of ancient Sith ruins and an old dark side academy, which left the entire planet soaked in deadly dark side energy. Revan sent a huge Republic fleet to Malachor 5 to act as bait, meant to lure the full Mandalorian force into one final battle that he intended no Mandalorian to walk away from. He divided his forces and handed half of them to a general he trusted completely, a woman named Mitra Surik, who would one day be remembered as the Exile. Her task was to draw the Mandalorians into range of the hidden weapon. That weapon was the Mass Shadow Generator. It was a kind of doomsday machine built around the power of gravity itself, created in secret by a gifted Zabrak engineer named Bao-Dur. Once triggered, it could tear open a gravitational vortex strong enough to crush whole fleets and even break a planet apart. The Mandalorians took the bait. Sensing a chance to destroy the Republic fleet and finally break Revan's campaign for good, they committed their main strength to the Battle of Malachor 5, sailing straight into the deadliest trap the galaxy had ever known. Mandalore the Ultimate led the charge himself, hungry to face Revan in the flesh and prove that the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy could never be undone by a single Jedi strategist. A gigantic space battle exploded in orbit above Malachor 5 as the two greatest fleets of the entire age slammed into one another. It was the boiling point of 16 years of conquest and revenge, all of it quietly steered by the hidden hand of the Sith. And what was about to happen above that quiet farming world would do far more than end the Mandalorian Wars. It would break the Mandalorian people and leave a lasting scar on the Force itself. And it would finish Revan's long, slow slide into the dark side once and for all. A people can lose a battle and still find a way to recover. What happened above Malachor 5 was something else entirely. The day an entire warrior nation was broken by a single, terrible blow. The fighting kicked off in orbit, exactly where Revan wanted it. He had chosen this world for one cold reason. Its hidden dark side power and its position made it the perfect place to draw his enemy in and finish them off. Revan himself was not even there at the start, though. A Mandalorian scouting party caught him outside the system and held him up, which left Meetra Surik in direct command of the trap. So while the Republic and Mandalorian fleets tore into each other above the planet, it was Surik standing at the center of it all. There was a danger that nobody on the Republic side could see at first. The dark side energy pouring out of those ancient Sith ruins on Malachor V was seeping into Revan's Jedi as they fought. It quietly wore down their defenses and sped up the very corruption that the long, ugly war had already started in so many of them. The longer they fought on that world, the deeper the darkness sank its claws in. Revan eventually broke through and reached the system while the space battle still raged all around him. He pushed his way through the chaos and made straight for Mandalore, the Ultimate's flagship. He had one goal in mind. He was going to end the leader of the Mandalorians with his own hands. The two of them came face to face aboard that flagship. It was the Republic's greatest warrior against the supreme leader of the most dangerous warrior culture the galaxy had ever produced. They fought one against one, and in the end, Revan got the better of him and brought him down. What came next was a moment the Mandalorians would not learn about for a very long time. In his final breaths, the fallen warlord reached up and pulled off his own mask. Then he told Revan the secret he had been carrying through the entire war. He had never truly been the one in control. A hidden Sith Emperor, tucked away in the unknown regions, had been steering him the whole time, using him to set off this enormous war for reasons of his own. Before he was gone, Mandalore the Ultimate handed Revan a set of coordinates, a path pointing straight toward that hidden Sith threat. It was the last thing he ever did, and it would change everything. Those coordinates would send Revan and Malak down a dark road of their own, one that led toward a place called the Star Forge, and, in time, toward their complete fall to the Sith. But that is a story for another day. Back above Malachor V, the leader of the Mandalorians was gone, and the two fleets were locked in a deadlock that neither one could break. This was the moment Meetra Surik had been dreading. With everything hanging in the balance, she gave the order that would define the whole battle and haunt her for the rest of her life. There was no shouted command. It was just a single silent nod to Bao-Dur, telling him to switch on the mass shadow generator. In a single instant, the weapon came alive. It ripped open an enormous vortex of gravity so strong that nothing close to it could pull free. The force yanked a huge chunk of both fleets straight out of orbit and dragged the ships downward, smashing them into the surface of the planet below. The power of it was so extreme that it cracked Malachor V apart all the way down to its core. That peaceful world Revan had chosen was ripped into a scattered cluster of broken chunks, the pieces barely held together by strange tugs of gravity. The mass shadow generator did not care whose side anyone was on. Mandalorian ships and Republic ships were torn apart all the same, and even Revan's own Jedi were caught in it. Only the vessels that happened to sit outside the vortex's reach made it through, and that included the ships carrying Revan and Surik themselves. For the Mandalorians, this was a disaster beyond anything they had ever faced. They had thrown their main strength into this one battle, and now almost all of it was gone in a matter of moments. Their losses were so heavy that the warrior culture would not bounce back from them for generations. The handful of Mandalorian ships still intact sent out an immediate and total surrender. With that one broadcast, 16 years of war came crashing to a sudden and shattering stop. What was left behind was a haunting sight. Malachor V had become a desolate wasteland, its surface buried under the wreckage of countless warships. The only things moving across its broken pieces were the vicious storm beasts that the disaster itself had somehow brought into being. The Mandalorians would remember that day with a kind of grim respect, giving it a name that said it all. They called it the Great Last Battle. It was a defeat so complete that it broke their entire civilization in a single stroke. The damage went far deeper than ships and warriors, though. Setting off the mass shadow generator left a permanent scar on the Force itself. Malachor V became known as a wound in the Force, a place so heavy with loss and pain that it would go on to play a major role in the rise of a Sith Lord called Darth Traya years later. The Mandalorians who lived through it now had to face some hard truths all at once. Their leader was gone, and their fleet was gone with him. Worse still, the fearsome reputation they had carried for thousands of years, the belief that they could not be conquered, had been torn apart by a single Jedi's trap. Then Revan laid down harsh terms on the people he had beaten. He stripped the surviving warriors of their armor and their weapons, forcing them to give everything up completely just to be allowed to live. His most lasting move, though, was something else entirely. Revan took the mask of Mandalore, the very symbol that had stood for Mandalorian leadership since the days of Mandalore I, and he hid it away where no one could find it. Without that mask, no new leader could ever rise to pull the clans back together. With their Mandalore gone and the mask out of reach, the Mandalorians had no proper way left to choose anyone to follow. The warrior nation came apart, splintering into scattered clans with no one to lead them. The disarmed Mandalorians drifted out into the wider galaxy and took whatever work they could find. Some became hired guns. Others turned to fixing machines or scouting unknown space, selling their skills to anyone with credits to spend. The proud crusading tradition that had once terrified entire worlds was now reduced to taking odd jobs for pay. This disaster also pushed the Tong even closer to the end. Their numbers had been slipping away for a very long time, and Malachor V had wiped out a huge share of the warriors they had left. All of it left the Mandalorians at the absolute lowest point they had ever known. They had been beaten and stripped of their weapons. They were left without a leader and without any unity between the clans. And even the sacred symbol that once bound them together had been taken away. And yet, for all of that, the Mandalorians did not vanish. The thing that truly made them who they were could not be taken by force. Their code and their language lived on. So did their armor, and the memory of everything they had once been, kept alive quietly inside those scattered clans. All of it was waiting for someone who could gather them back together and return the mask of Mandalore to where it belonged. There is one more piece of this aftermath worth holding on to. Years later, in a completely different fight, Mitra Surik would come back to Malachor V to face Darth Traya and the Sith Triumvirate, and she would set off the mass shadow generator one last time to put an end to the Dark Academy hidden there. The legacy of the Mandalorian Wars ran deep. It turned Revan into a Sith Lord and left a lasting wound on the Force, and it knocked the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy down to a scattered handful. But buried inside all that ruin was a single seed. The Mandalorians would rise again, slowly and stubbornly. And here is the strange part. That comeback would not be led by some ancient Tong warlord with a noble line behind him. It would come from a human fighter of Clan Ordo, a man named Kandaros, who had lived through the horror of Malachor V and never let go of the dream of bringing his people back. Stranger still, the recovered mask of Mandalore would one day be placed into his hands by the very man who had crushed them all. The Mandalorians did not come storming back from the edge of ruin. This time, their comeback was slow and quiet, built one warrior at a time. After the disaster at Malachor V, Canderous Ordo did what most of the disarmed survivors did. He put his fighting skills up for hire, trading conquest for a paycheck. Eventually, he landed on the city world of Taris, taking work under a powerful crime lord named Davik Kang. This is where fate played one of its strangest tricks. While he was living on Taris, Canderos crossed paths with a man he did not recognize at all. The man was Revan himself. But this was not the same Revan who had broken the Mandalorians above Malachor V. After that war, Revan had fallen to the dark side, exactly as the hidden Sith Emperor had always intended, and he turned against the very republic he had once saved. A new conflict called the Jedi Civil War followed. By the end of it, Revan had been captured, and the Jedi Council wiped his memory completely clean, leaving him with no idea who he had once been. So when Canderous met this quiet blank slate of a man, he had no clue he was standing next to his old enemy. The two of them ended up joining forces, climbing aboard a freighter called the Ebon Hawk and fighting side by side. Their enemy this time was a Sith empire ruled by Revan's own former friend, who now went by the name Darth Malak. Together they brought down Malak's empire and destroyed the source of all his power, a massive ancient factory known as the Star Forge. All through these adventures, Canderous was a walking reminder of what the Mandalorians had once been. He was proud and blunt, with no patience at all for weakness, and he never stopped talking about the glory days of the Neo-Crusaders before everything came apart at Malachor V. By the time it was all over, Revan owed Canderos a great deal. As a way of thanking him for his part in stopping the Sith, Revan handed over something he had kept hidden for years. He gave Canderous the recovered mask of Mandalore, the very symbol he had once taken away from the Mandalorians after their defeat. Along with the mask came a charge. Revan asked Canderous to do one enormous thing for him. He was to gather the scattered Mandalorian clans and get them ready for a destiny that was still on its way. Revan never spelled it all out, but it was a quiet warning about the hidden Sith threat that he himself was now setting out to face for good. So Canderous began his mission, and somewhere along that journey, he had an encounter that changed him completely. He came across an aging Tong who was near the end of his life. This old warrior made a bold claim. He said that he was the true Mandalore, and he branded Mandalore the ultimate, a fraud, a false leader whose ties to the Sith had poisoned the entire title. Before he passed, the old Tong handed Canderous his own armor and his clan, and he asked for just one thing in return. He wanted Canderous to protect and carry on the old ways of the Mandalorians. It was a powerful moment. One of the very last members of the founding species was handing the future of his entire people over to a human. Canderous honored that request in full. He worked the recovered mask of Mandalore into his own helmet and put on the armor the old Tong had given him. He folded that clan into his own clan Ordo, and then he took up the title that would define the rest of his life. From that day on, he was Mandalore the Preserver. The name Preserver said exactly what his whole mission was about. Earlier leaders had set out to conquer the galaxy, or to completely remake the culture from the ground up. Canderous had a different and far more urgent job sitting in front of him. He was there to save a people who had come within a hair of vanishing for good. For his base of operations, the Preserver reclaimed an abandoned Mandalorian outpost on Djarin, one of the moons circling the planet Onderon. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Djarin was the very same wild jungle moon where Mandalore the Indomitable had met his end centuries earlier. Choosing that spot was no accident. It tied the rebirth of the Mandalorians directly to the proud and painful history of those old Republic wars and to the warriors who had fallen during them. The Preserver guarded his identity with total discipline. He never took his helmet off in front of anyone, and by some accounts, he kept it on even while he slept. There was a clear reason behind this. He wanted the office of Mandalore to matter far more than whatever single person happened to be wearing the mask at the time. From his base on Djarin, the Preserver took on the slow and patient work of pulling the clans back together. He recruited warriors of every kind, fighters who had been scattered to every corner of the galaxy after the war and were now ready to answer a Mandalorian call once again. His vision drew people in. Clan after clan answered him and rallied to his banner, pulled in by a promise that meant everything to them. The Mandalorians could rise again, but this time they would not repeat the reckless overreach that had nearly finished them. About 5 years after the Jedi Civil War, that rebuilt camp on Djarin got an unexpected visitor. Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile, was searching for a Jedi master named Kavar on Onderon when she was forced to crash land on the moon. That crash landing brought her right into the heart of the Preserver's growing Mandalorian community. The Preserver and his warriors ended up fighting alongside Surik against the Sith Triumvirate during a dark stretch known as the First Jedi Purge. It was proof of just how far the Mandalorians had come back. The reborn clans could once again stand as a serious fighting force in the affairs of the wider galaxy. Under the Preserver, the Mandalorians became something better than they had been before. They let go of the cruelty of the Neo-Crusader days, the kind of thinking that had once pushed them to try and erase an entire species. In its place, they rebuilt a more disciplined warrior identity, one focused on honor and survival, with raw strength to back it all up. This was the real turning point for the whole culture. The Mandalorians stopped being a conquering empire that lived only to expand. They became something tougher and more flexible, a warrior people who could take a heavy blow and still find a way to rebuild themselves no matter what the galaxy threw at them. This was also the era when the Tong finally faded almost completely from the story. That old warrior who had passed his clan to Canderous was one of the very last of the founding species. After him, the Mandalorians were a people of many different species, with humans like Canderous Ordo now leading a culture that had once belonged to a single ancient race. The huge change that Mandalore the Ultimate had started, throwing the doors open to everyone, was now the way things were. History would treat Mandalore the Preserver kindly. He became one of the most respected leaders the Mandalorians ever had, remembered for pulling his people back from the very brink and for putting the mask of Mandalore back at the head of a living, breathing nation. Under him, the Mandalorians stood as a recognized power once more. They could hire out their warriors and defend their own space, and once again they commanded real respect across the galaxy. The centuries right after his reign are mostly a blank in the records. Even so, the work he did made sure the Mandalorian way would survive the long and stormy stretch of time between the age of the Old Republic and the eventual rise of the Galactic Empire. There would be plenty more hardship ahead. The Mandalorians still had many wars to fight and many splits to suffer, and they would brush up against total destruction more than once. But the foundation the Preserver had laid down on Djarin was strong enough to carry the warrior tradition through every single one of those disasters. In the end, his greatest gift to his people was an idea. He proved that being a Mandalorian was never really about one leader or one homeworld. It was about a shared way of life and a code that could outlast all of them. For ages afterward, the Mandalorians stayed a power out on the frontier of the galaxy. They moved through a long rhythm of history, coming together under strong leaders in some eras and breaking apart into feuding clans in others, an endless back and forth of decline and revival. And that very cycle was about to carry them straight into their next great disaster. This time, it would not come from the Sith or from some twisted superweapon. It would come from the Republic itself, in a clash that would burn their homeworld down to white ash and tear their culture clean in two for 1,000 years to come. From here, the story leaps forward across thousands of years. And somewhere in that long stretch of time, the very first Mandalorians, the Tong themselves, quietly slipped out of the galaxy for good. We have followed the Tong since the very beginning, from their old home all the way to the world they conquered and renamed after their leader. For ages, their numbers had been shrinking, worn thin by a culture that kept spending its best warriors in one war after another. By this point, that long fade finally reached its end. The founding species was gone. But the idea they had created did not vanish with them. The many peoples they had taken in over the centuries carried it forward, exactly as Mandalore the Ultimate and Mandalore the Preserver had always hoped they would. By the later centuries of the Republic, being a Mandalorian had nothing to do with what species you happened to be born into. It was about the armor you wore and the language you spoke, about the creed you lived by, and the 6 core actions every Mandalorian was bound to follow. The records of these middle centuries are thin, but the broad shape of them is clear. The Mandalorians stayed split into their clans and houses, and every so often a strong leader would rise up, claim the mask of Mandalore, and pull the feuding families together for a while. They kept up their fearsome name across the galaxy, hiring themselves out as soldiers and throwing themselves into countless fights, all while holding on to their culture and their old grudge against the Republic and the Jedi. During this same long stretch, the wider galaxy was tearing itself apart in something called the New Sith Wars. This was a struggle that dragged on for 1,000 years, a grinding tug of war between the Republic and one Sith faction after another. It finally came to an end when the Jedi won a decisive victory at the 7th Battle of Ruusan, around 1,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. After all that, the Republic was desperate for lasting peace. So it pushed through a huge set of changes known as the Ruusan Reformations, reshaping the galaxy and pulling back the militaries of many sectors in the hope of finally calming everything down. The Mandalorians went the exact other way. With the galaxy settling into a quieter period, the clans came back together and set out to rebuild themselves into something stronger and more modern than ever, with better technology and a tighter, harder warrior society. This fresh burst of Mandalorian power started throwing its weight around. The clans began taxing the trade that ran along a major space lane nearby called the Hydian Way. They tied neighboring worlds to themselves through deals over defense and money. and they flatly refused to follow the Republic's new rules limiting how large any one sector could build up its own forces. To the Republic and the Jedi, all of this was deeply alarming. The Sith Wars had only just ended, and now a powerful and aggressive warrior people was rising fast, right on the edge of their territory. They were terrified of watching a brand new threat take shape so soon after surviving the last one. Not every Mandalorian wanted this fight, though. A group of clan leaders spoke up and urged caution. They argued that Mandalore would be far better off making peace and joining the Republic as a strong and respected sector instead of picking a fight it had no real chance of winning. But these voices were drowned out by the louder, more warlike clans who held the real power. Mandalore kept right on building up its strength in open defiance, and that defiance practically dared the Republic to strike first. Strike first is exactly what the Republic did. Around 738 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi Order decided it would not sit around and wait for a second great Mandalorian war to break out. So they put together a powerful strike force, pulling in the Republic's judicial forces along with the planetary security forces of a region called the Expansion Region, and they aimed all of it at Mandalorian space for one overwhelming surprise attack. The fight that followed was short, but it was punishing. The Mandalorians came to call it the Dral Han, a word in their language that meant the annihilation. The rest of the galaxy would remember it as the Mandalorian Excision, and it became one of the most devastating events these people ever lived through. The Jedi-led forces hammered the most important Mandalorian worlds. They came down on key planets like Fennel and Ordo. They struck Concord Dawn, and they pounded the homeworld of Mandalore itself. The bombardment was so relentless that whole stretches of these worlds were left in ruins. The attack on Mandalore was the one that left a permanent mark. The orbital fire came down so hard that it burned entire continents away. Everything green and living, along with the cities built on top of it, was scorched down into the very same thing: endless barren deserts of white sand. That white sand turned into the haunting, instantly recognizable face of Mandalore from that point on. It stood as a lasting reminder of the day the Republic broke the warrior clans apart from orbit. The Mandalorians never stood a chance in this one. They were hopelessly outmatched, and their losses were staggering. Once the fighting stopped, the Republic disarmed them and moved in to occupy their space, setting up a temporary caretaker government to run the region. That occupation stretched on for decades, and it cracked Mandalorian society wide open along a brand new line. On one hand were the people who held tight to the warrior traditions, certain that strength was still the only real answer. On the other were those who looked out at the white sand wastes and decided that the old way of battle had brought them nothing but ruin. Out of that second group, something completely new was born. They called themselves the New Mandalorians. This was a political movement built on reform, with roots that reached back to that earlier peace faction which had been shouted down before the Excision. The New Mandalorians turned their backs on fighting altogether, holding up peace and total neutrality as the highest values a Mandalorian could possibly have. These reformers took the famous Mandalorian talent for engineering and building and pointed it in a brand new direction. Instead of weapons of war, they built cities. In the middle of those harsh white sand deserts where the old way of life could no longer survive, they raised grand domed cities, each one sealed off with its own controlled climate inside, safe from the wasteland all around them. The crown jewel of this new civilization was their domed capital, a gleaming city called Sundari. It was clean and peaceful, completely sealed against the harsh desert outside, and every detail of it was a deliberate rejection of the warrior culture that had defined Mandalore for thousands of years. Over time, the new Mandalorians took control of the planet's government and much of its society. They won out politically over the old warrior clans and showed a calm, gentle face to the rest of the galaxy. This is the moment that created the great divide that would shape Mandalore for the rest of its history. From here on, the homeworld was a house split against itself. The peaceful new Mandalorians ruled from their sealed cities, while the warrior clans, refusing to give up the old creed and the way of battle, simmered against them. Many of those traditional warriors got pushed out or shoved to the edges by the new Mandalorian government. But they did not disappear. They kept their armor and their creed alive out in the wild places of the homeworld and on a nearby moon called Concordia. Plenty more carried it with them inside mercenary outfits spread all across the galaxy. So the excision left the Mandalorians badly broken in body, but it did not erase them. Instead, it split them clean in two. Both sides, the peaceful reformers and the unbroken warriors, each believed with all their heart that they were the ones carrying the true future of the Mandalorian people. Underneath that calm, pacifist surface, the warrior tradition never actually went away. It kept burning quietly for centuries, carefully protected by a handful of proud clans. Names like Visla and Kryze kept it alive, and so did Ordo and Fett, all of them waiting for the right leader to come along and bring the old ways roaring back. And that leader was already on his way. In the decades just before a galaxy-changing conflict known as the Clone Wars, a reformer would step forward with a bold idea. He wanted to take the fierce Mandalorian warrior spirit and aim it towards something honorable. His name was Jaster Mereel, and his ideas would lay the groundwork for the most famous Mandalorians the galaxy would ever know. Starting with a boy he would one day raise as his own son, a child named Jango Fett. The next great Mandalorian war had nothing to do with land or treasure. At its heart sat a single, simple question. What did it truly mean to be a Mandalorian? In the decades leading up to the Clone Wars, the Mandalorian people were still pulled in different directions. The peaceful new Mandalorians ran things from their sealed capital of Sundari, while the scattered warrior clans clung to the old creed of battle. Into this split and uncertain world stepped a man who would try to give the warriors back something they had lost a very long time ago. His name was Jaster Mereel. Mereel was a reformed man with a heavy past. By some accounts, he had once done terrible things, but he turned his life around and served as a journeyman protector, a kind of frontier lawman who kept order out on the edges of civilization. When he rose to become Mandalore, he set out to do something nobody had managed in ages. He wanted to bring honor back to the warrior clans. To pull it off, he wrote down a guide that would shape the Mandalorians for generations. He called it the Super Commando Codex. It was a long set of rules, hundreds of them, all built to turn the Mandalorians from lawless raiders into principled professional soldiers who could be proud of how they fought. Mereel did not invent these ideas out of thin air. He reached back into Mandalorian history and pulled from the ancient, half-forgotten canons of honor from the earliest days of his people. He blended those old laws together with the 6 core actions that every Mandalorian was meant to live by, and out of that mix, he forged a fresh code for a modern age. The heart of the Super Commando Codex was simple. Mandalorians were meant to be highly skilled, well-paid soldiers who fought with honor and decency. The Codex turned its back on the ugliest parts of the Mandalorian past. There would be no more needless violence and no more going after innocent people. The lawless robbery and raiding that had stained their name in earlier times was finished too. Plenty of Mandalorians loved this vision. Mariel's followers came from the standing army of Mandalore and from a number of proud clans, and they gathered under his banner as the true Mandalorians. They became a disciplined fighting force bound by honor, fully loyal to the Codex and everything it stood for. But not everyone was on board. A violent group of warriors completely rejected Mariel's new code, and they were led by a hardline fighter named Tor Vizsla. Vizsla and his people longed for the old days when the Mandalorians were conquerors who took whatever they wanted by force. To them, Mariel's idea of an honorable mercenary was a total betrayal of who the Mandalorians really were. They wanted to bring back the old wars of conquest and chase galactic domination all over again. These breakaway warriors formed their own group, and they called it the Death Watch. In their own language of Mandalore, the name was Kurt-Saad. The Death Watch was a vicious and undisciplined movement, one that fully embraced the old raider mindset and treated war as something to be celebrated for its own sake. So now, there were 2 completely opposite visions of the Mandalorian future, and they could not exist side by side. The clash between Mariel's true Mandalorians and Vizsla's Death Watch broke out into open warfare. It was a war over the very soul of the Mandalorian people, and it became known as the Mandalorian Civil War. All the while, the peaceful new Mandalorians wanted nothing to do with either side. They held tight to their belief in non-violence and rejected both warrior factions completely, choosing to stay out of the whole thing. That choice only deepened the divide, splitting the Mandalorian people 3 ways now instead of 2. The Civil War spread out across many star systems, with the true Mandalorians and the Death Watch trading blow after blow on world after world. Each side was fighting to decide, once and for all, what the Mandalorians were going to be. Around 58 years before the Battle of Yavin, the war reached a farming world we have heard about before, Concord Dawn. Mariel had come there to face the Death Watch head-on, but the fight turned against him. A firefight went badly, and suddenly the Mandalore himself was being hunted across the planet. With the enemy closing in, Mariel and his true Mandalorians ran for cover, slipping into the tall crop fields to hide. They got help from an unexpected source. A local farmer took them in. This farmer happened to be a journeyman protector himself, a man named Fett, who had actually taken over that lawman role after Mariel left it behind. The farmer and his family hid the warriors and kept them fed and safe from the Death Watch. But the Death Watch was relentless. They tracked the true Mandalorians all the way to Concord Dawn, and when they could not find them, they grabbed the farmer's young son. The boy's name was Jango Fett. They roughed him up and tried to force him to give away where Mariel's fighters were hiding. Then came the moment that shaped the rest of Jango's life. The Death Watch attacked the Fett farm directly, and in the chaos that followed, Jango lost both of his parents. Just like that, a young boy was left an orphan in the middle of a war that had nothing to do with him. Jaster Mariel pulled Jango out of that attack and got him to safety. Something about the boy stuck with him. He had seen Django's courage, and he had seen what the boy's family had given up to protect the true Mandalorians. So Mariel made a decision that would ripple out across all of galactic history. He took Django in and raised him as his own son. Growing up under Mariel, Django was shaped into a true Mandalorian in every sense. He learned the Super Commando Codex by heart and trained hard as a fighter, soaking up the whole culture of honor that Mariel had worked so hard to build. He turned into one of the most valuable members of the entire group, fighting in the ongoing battles against the Death Watch and proving to everyone that he was both a fearsome soldier and a natural-born leader. Not everything in Mariel's ranks was smooth, though. A rivalry grew between Django and another Mandalorian named Montrose. Montrose was an aggressive and ambitious fighter who could not stand the special treatment that Mariel's adopted son seemed to get, and he bristled under the Mandalore's command. He kept pushing Mariel to drop his restraint and go for the complete destruction of the Death Watch. Montrose carried exactly the kind of aggressive, take-no-prisoners attitude that the Super Commando Codex had been written to hold in check. The civil war dragged on and on, with neither side able to land a knockout blow. The true Mandalorians and the Death Watch kept trading wins and committing dark deeds out on the frontier worlds year after year. By around 52 years before the Battle of Yavin, 6 years after everything that happened on Concord Dawn, Jaster Mariel believed he had finally won. He thought the Death Watch had been finished for good. With his great enemy seemingly gone, he led the true Mandalorians as a clean professional mercenary force, taking honest contracts from legitimate clients across the galaxy. They had become exactly what Mariel had always dreamed of, an honorable and disciplined band of super commandos whose reputation for skill and integrity set them far apart from the lawlessness of their past. It was in this role that Mariel took on a job from the Corda Defense Force. The contract was to go and rescue a rookie security team that was pinned down and taking fire on a world called Corda 6. Everything about the mission looked easy, the kind of simple, low-risk job that promised good money for very little danger. Thinking it would be a quick and painless operation, Mariel split his men into 3 groups. Vertigo Company went to Montrose. A second team, known as Django's Grunts, was handed to a now teenage Django Fett, and Mariel kept his own headhunter company for the main task of reaching the trapped security team. But the whole thing was a setup. The Death Watch had never really been destroyed. Tor Vizsla was very much alive, and he had been patiently waiting for a chance exactly like this. A chance to ambush his hated rival and finish him off once and for all. What happened next at the Battle of Corda 6 and the betrayal that came with it would change everything. It would cost Jaster Mariel his life and push Django Fett into the role of Mandalore. And it would be the very first link in a chain of events that dragged the true Mandalorians toward their terrible end on a world called Galadron. Jaster Mariel had spent his life building the most honorable warriors the Mandalorians had seen in centuries. A single, carefully built lie was about to bring almost the entire group to ruin. It started at Corda 6. The mission that was supposed to be quick and easy turned out to be a Death Watch ambush. The minimal resistance the intel had promised vanished in an instant, and the true Mandalorians found themselves pinned down in a deadly trap. Worst of all, it left Jaster Mariel exposed and out in the open, right in front of the one enemy who hated him most. That was the moment Montrose showed his true colors. He was leading the airborne Vertigo Company, and when Tor Vizsla closed in on the wounded Mareel, Montross did the unthinkable. Instead of flying in to rescue his leader, he left the injured Mandalore stranded and alone on the battlefield. With Mareel down and helpless, Tor Vizsla moved in for the finish. Vizsla carried the scars from years of clashing with the true Mandalorians, and he had waited a long time for this. From inside his armored tank, he opened up with its heavy cannons and ended Jaster Mareel's life, finally getting the revenge he had craved for so long. But Jango Fett refused to let it end there. He fought his way back through the chaos to the landing zone, and he carried his fallen father back with him. By bringing Mareel home, Jango exposed Montross for exactly what he was, a liar and a traitor who had let his own leader fall. He would not allow the truth of what happened to be quietly buried. Montross tried to talk his way out of it. He claimed that Mareel would have wanted him to take command of the true Mandalorians. The surviving warriors were not buying any of it. They turned on Montross at Blaster Point and made it clear that there was only one person they would follow now. That person was Jango Fett, the heir Jaster Mareel had personally chosen. In the end, Montross was grudgingly allowed to walk away, and he slipped off into exile. Jango, meanwhile, took up the mantle his adoptive father had left behind. He became the new Mandalore and the leader of the true Mandalorians. As a young Mandalore, Jango carried on the war his father had started against the Death Watch. He led his people exactly the way Mareel had taught him, holding firmly to the principles of the Super Commando Codex that had been drilled into him since he was a boy. But the blow that finally broke the true Mandalorians did not come from the Death Watch in a straight fight. It came from something far more underhanded, a clever and elaborate plot that Tor Vizsla cooked up with the help of a corrupt official. The setting for this scheme was an outer rim world called Galidran. Working hand in hand with the planet's governor, the Death Watch carried out a terrible attack against the civilians living there. Then they made it look as though the true Mandalorians had been the ones responsible for the whole thing. The crooked governor of Galidran ran straight to the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order with his version of events. He fed them a complete lie, claiming that the honorable true Mandalorians were the ones harming innocent people, and he begged for someone to step in and stop them. The Jedi answered the call. They sent a task force to Galidran, and it was led by a Jedi master named Dooku. This was decades before Dooku would fall to the dark side himself, a detail worth holding on to for later. Backing him up were Republic judicial forces, and at his side was his young apprentice, a Padawan named Komari Vosa. Here is where the real tragedy of it all comes into focus. Jango had only just made it back to his troops' camp to warn them that the Death Watch had set a trap when the Jedi task force suddenly arrived. Everything fell apart before anyone could figure out the truth. Master Dooku ordered the true Mandalorians to lower their weapons and stand down, and he promised they would be treated fairly. At the same time, his Padawan Komari Vosa gave them a much colder message. She warned that if they chose to fight, swift justice would be coming for them. From Jango's point of view, this looked like the end of everything. He was convinced the Jedi had come to destroy his people on the strength of the Death Watch's lies. So he gave the order to open fire. And just like that, a fierce and heartbreaking battle erupted between two groups who never should have been enemies at all: the true Mandalorians and the Jedi. At first, the Jedi made it look almost effortless. They deflected the Mandalorians' blaster fire with their lightsabers, sending the bolts right back and taking down many of Jango's men with their own shots. Jango quickly saw his mistake. He shouted for his warriors to switch over to projectile weapons, the kind of solid rounds that a lightsaber could not swat out of the air. That change turned the fight into something far closer and far uglier. It became desperate, close-range fighting all across the field. Komari Vosa was a storm all by herself. She overwhelmed dozens of Mandalorians and took down at least 20 of them on her own, while the rest of the Jedi pushed deep into the true Mandalorian lines. The losses were staggering on both sides, and that is the part most people miss. Dooku himself would later admit that more than half of his Jedi were lost that day, along with most of their judicial backup. It was a powerful reminder of just how dangerous the Mandalorians could be, even when they were outnumbered and going up against people who could use the Force. Out of at least 300 true Mandalorians who stood on Galadran that day, only one of them was left on his feet at the end. That man was Jango Fett. He took down several Jedi all by himself, including a few with nothing but his bare hands, fighting for his fallen brothers even as everything he believed in crumbled around him. He had even brought down the Jedi who had taken his close friend Miles from him. But as the last Mandalorian standing, the grief finally caught up with Jango. The will to keep fighting drained right out of him, and Dooku and the surviving Jedi took him captive. The Battle of Galadran basically wiped the true Mandalorians off the board as a fighting force. The disciplined and honorable super commandos that Jaster Mareel had spent his life building were all but gone after a single tragic battle. The real truth that the Death Watch had staged the entire thing from start to finish would not come out until much later. By then, it was far too late. The damage was done, and Mareel's whole reform movement lay in ruins. For Jango, things only got worse from there. Instead of any fair treatment, the corrupt governor of Galadran handed him over to be sold. Jango spent years after that as a prisoner, forced to work aboard a spice transport, his days as a proud Mandalore feeling like a distant memory. But you cannot keep a warrior like Jango Fett down forever. Eventually, he broke free from his captors and escaped. He went back and recovered his Mandalorian armor from the governor of Galadran, and then he set out with one clear purpose burning inside him. He was going to make things right for the true Mandalorians and for his adoptive father. His hunt led him to the planet Corellia, where he finally tracked down Tor Vizsla's ship. The two of them faced each other one last time. After a long and grueling fight, Jango brought Tor Vizsla down for good. With that single act, he struck the final blow of the long Mandalorian Civil War. With Vizsla gone, what was left of the Death Watch scattered and went into hiding. Their movement was broken, and they were terrified of the man who had taken down so many Jedi single-handedly at Galadran. The Super Commando Codex would live on and keep shaping Mandalorians for years to come. But Jango himself never really acted as Mandalore again in the old way. The true Mandalorians were gone, and there was nothing left for him to lead. So Jango turned toward a completely different kind of life. Hardened by losing his adoptive father and his closest comrades, and by watching the cause he believed in fall apart, Jango Fett became a lone bounty hunter. He poured all of his unmatched fighting skill into what was the most profitable and most dangerous job in the entire galaxy. And that reputation he had earned as the warrior who had taken down so many Jedi at Galadran was about to catch the eye of someone very powerful and very dangerous. Somewhere out in the galaxy, a Sith Lord was searching for the perfect template to build an entire army of clones. And Jango Fett was exactly what he was looking for. For thousands of years, the Mandalorians had lived and breathed the way of the warrior. One woman was determined to put an end to all of that for good, and it would cost her everything. Her name was Duchess Satine Kryze, and she led the peaceful new Mandalorians during the Clone Wars. From the safety of the domed capital of Sundari, she stood for a brand new path built on neutrality and reform, doing everything in her power to heal a people who had been worn down by centuries of fighting. Satine was no minor figure either. She led a group called the Council of Neutral Systems, which brought together thousands of star systems that all refused to pick a side in the Clone Wars. That made her one of the most respected and principled voices anywhere in the galaxy. She was deeply committed to leaving Mandalore's violent past behind. To make that happen, she took the planet's remaining traditional warriors and sent them into exile on Mandalore's moon, Concordia. Her hope was to finally cut her people off from the warlike culture that had brought them so much ruin over the ages. But the way of the warrior does not give up that easily. Hidden among those exiles and quietly tucked away inside Mandalorian society, the old Death Watch had survived. Even after Tor Vizsla had fallen, the group lived on and rebuilt itself under fresh leadership. The new Death Watch was led by a man named Pre Vizsla, who served as the governor of Concordia. In public, he played the part of a loyal supporter of Duchess Satine. In private, he was scheming to tear her government down and bring back the old warrior ways of Mandalore. Pre Vizsla also carried a remarkable weapon, one with deep roots in Mandalorian history. It was called the Darksaber. This was a one-of-a-kind lightsaber with a black blade, forged more than 1,000 years earlier by Tar Vizsla, who holds the honor of being the very first Mandalorian ever accepted into the Jedi Order. The blade was far more than just a weapon. It stood as a sacred symbol of Mandalorian leadership. After Tar Vizsla was gone, the Darksaber had been kept safe inside the Jedi Temple. But House Vizsla eventually stole it back, and over time, holding that blade became tied directly to the right to rule all of Mandalore as Mandalore. Pre Vizsla had a key second in command, and her identity made everything even more personal. Her name was Bo-Katan Kryze, and she was Duchess Satine's own estranged sister. Bo-Katan was a fierce fighter who led an elite Death Watch unit known as the Night Owls, and she fully embraced the warrior heritage that her sister had turned her back on. From their secret base on Concordia, the Death Watch began their campaign to bring Satine down. They carried out attacks on new Mandalorian cities and on a world called Kalevala, all of it designed to shake people's faith in Satine's peaceful government. Their true plans came to light during a tense run-in with the Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi, who happened to be an old and dear friend of Satine. It was Kenobi who uncovered their scheme to wrestle Mandalore away from the new Mandalorians. In their first real grab for power, Pre Vizsla and the Death Watch teamed up with the separatist leader Count Dooku, hoping to seize Mandalore together. But that alliance broke apart, and their early attempt fell flat, sending them back into hiding to wait for a better moment. Meanwhile, the chaos of the Clone Wars was wrecking Mandalore's economy. With trade routes cut off, the new Mandalorians were pushed toward dealing on the black market. On top of that, a corruption scandal involving Prime Minister Almec chipped away even further at Satine's authority. Around this same time, a completely separate Mandalorian movement popped up out of nowhere. It started with a man called Spar, who was actually a deserter clone trooper grown from the genes of Jango Fett. Spar made his way to the struggling world of Mandalore, where a clan chieftain named Fen Shaisa encouraged him to take up the empty title of Mandalore. Shaisa spread the word that Spar was a true son and heir of Jango Fett, leaning on the famous Fett name as warriors who could stand against the Jedi, all to lift the spirits of his people. Spar accepted, stepping into the role of a new Mandalorian leader. Spar then founded a revived warrior group he called the Mandalorian Protectors. He modeled it on the fallen true Mandalorians that Jaster Mareel had once built, and he pulled its members from wherever he could, mixing in local police and former Death Watch fighters, and even putting battle droids into the ranks, all to defend Mandalorian interests. But this revival was not meant to last. Darth Sidious saw the Mandalorians as a threat to his master plan, and he set a trap for the Protectors. On a world called Norval II, they were ambushed and nearly wiped out by Republic troops. Only 3 of them walked away from that disaster. There was Spar himself, along with Fen Shaisa and his close friend, Toby Dalla. Deeply shaken by what he had seen, Spar gave up the title of Mandalore, leaving the shattered remains of the Mandalorian Protectors in the hands of Fen Shaisa. But the heaviest blow to Satine's rule was still coming, and it arrived in the form of an old enemy nobody ever expected to see again. Around 20 years before the Battle of Yavin, a former Sith Lord named Maul set his sights on Mandalore. Maul had survived a duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi about 10 years earlier, and he wanted nothing more than revenge. Maul and his brother Savage Opress struck up a deal with Pre Vizsla's Death Watch. It worked out nicely for both sides. The Sith would help the Death Watch overthrow Satine, and in return, the Death Watch would help Maul get his revenge on Kenobi. Together, they pulled together a huge criminal coalition that they called the Shadow Collective. It joined the Death Watch with some of the most feared underworld groups in the galaxy. The Pike Syndicate came on board, and so did the Black Sun and the Hutt clans. All of them melded into one massive criminal army. Then came the Khan. The Shadow Collective's criminals launched a staged attack on Sundari and New Mandalorian territory, spreading panic and chaos all through the capital. As fear gripped the people and they cried out for someone to save them, Pre Vizsla and the Death Watch made their move. They swept in looking like heroes, beating back the very criminals they had secretly turned loose in the first place. The public adored them for it. And that wave of public love was exactly what Pre Vizsla needed. He used it to push Duchess Satine out of power and seize control of Mandalore. With Mandalore in his grip, Pre Vizsla declared himself both Prime Minister and Mandalore, and he had Satine thrown in prison. But almost immediately, he turned on the Sith who had helped him get there. He had Maul and Savage Opress locked up. That turned out to be a serious mistake. Maul challenged Pre Vizsla to a traditional one-on-one duel for the leadership of the Death Watch. The 2 of them fought, and Maul came out on top. He defeated Pre Vizsla and ended his life, then claimed both the Darksaber and the throne of Mandalore for himself. Maul's victory split the Death Watch right down the middle. Bo-Katan and her Night Owls flatly refused to follow an outsider Sith Lord, so they broke away from the group. Maul, now in charge, set up the corrupt Almec as his puppet prime minister to do his bidding. Then came the moment that broke Mandalore's heart. Obi-Wan Kenobi came to the planet to rescue Satine, going against the wishes of the Jedi Council to do it. But Maul captured them both, and to wound his old enemy as deeply as he possibly could, Maul ended Duchess Satine's life right there in front of Kenobi, using the Darksaber to do it. Losing Satine snuffed out the brightest hope the Mandalorians had ever had for real peace. Her loss threw her people right back into the very cycle of violence that she had given her whole life trying to end. It was a painful proof of an old truth, that those who turn their backs on the lessons of the past put their entire future at risk. The Clone Wars eventually came to a close, and Maul's hold on Mandalore was finally broken during a campaign known as the Siege of Mandalore. But by then the damage was already done. The dream of a peaceful Mandalore was gone, and something even darker was waiting just over the horizon. The rising galactic empire was about to bring the Mandalorian people a fate crueler than anything they had faced yet. The Jedi had nearly ended the Mandalorians at Galidran. What almost nobody saw coming was that a single Mandalorian was about to hand the galaxy the very tool that would one day bring the Jedi down. After settling his score with the Death Watch, Jango Fett rose to become the most feared bounty hunter anywhere in the galaxy. He took on the toughest and most dangerous jobs around, working out of his personal ship, a fire spray patrol craft he called the Slave One. His fearsome name was built on a couple of things. He had unmatched skill in a fight, and he wore that famous Mandalorian armor packed with weapons. But above all else, he had something almost no one else in the galaxy could claim. He had actually beaten the Jedi. That reputation came straight from his lone stand at Galidran, where he had taken down trained Jedi all by himself. Now remember that Jedi Master Dooku from Galidran and how we said his fall to the dark side was worth holding on to. This is where it pays off. By this point in the story, Dooku had become a Sith Lord under the name Darth Tyrannus. He served as the apprentice to a hidden master named Darth Sidious, and Tyrannus was on the hunt for something very specific. He needed the perfect genetic template for a secret army of clones that was being quietly built for the future of the Galactic Republic. To find the right person, Dooku set up an elaborate test. He put a bounty on the head of his own former Padawan, Komari Vosa. Since Galidran, Vosa had fallen to the dark side herself and taken control of a dangerous crime cult called the Bando Gora. Dooku's thinking was cold but clever. Any bounty hunter good enough to capture or take down a powerful Force user like Vosa would also be good enough to serve as the model for an army of clones built to fight Jedi. Dooku reached out to Jango personally and invited him to compete for the prize, drawn in by what Jango had done at Galidran. Jango did not disappoint. He outfought every other elite bounty hunter in the contest. Along the way, he earned the loyalty of a shape-shifting Clawdite assassin named Zam Wesell, and in the end, he defeated Komari Vosa and brought her in. But Vosa never made it to any prison. The moment Jango delivered her, Dooku reached out with the Force and ended his own former apprentice right there on the spot. With that, two things happened at once. Jango was confirmed as the winner and the chosen template, and Dooku quietly cleaned up a loose end of his own. Along with a hefty payment, Tyrannus offered Jango a very unusual deal. Jango would become the genetic blueprint for an entire army of clones, all of them to be grown on a distant, water-covered world called Kamino. Django took the deal. The cloners of Kamino, a species known as the Kaminoans, got to work and began producing millions of clone soldiers from his genetic material. These soldiers would go on to become the Grand Army of the Republic. There was something Django knew that he kept to himself. He had recognized Dooku right away as the same Jedi from Galadran. So he understood perfectly well that Tyrannus and Dooku were one and the same man. But when people later questioned him about it, he kept that knowledge hidden. Beyond the money, Django asked for only one more thing in return for everything he was giving. He wanted a single clone of himself left completely unaltered, one he could raise as his very own son. The army clones had been changed at the genetic level to make them obedient and to grow up fast. This one clone would have none of those changes. Django was given that pure clone, and he named the boy Boba Fett. In every way that mattered in his genes, Boba was Django himself. Django raised Boba both on Kamino and aboard the Slave One. He taught the boy how to fight and how to work the bounty hunter's trade, and he passed down the proud Mandalorian heritage that ran through the Fett family line. For Django, there was a quiet, hidden satisfaction buried in this whole arrangement. He was a Mandalorian who had lost everything to the Jedi at Galadran, and he understood something that the Jedi did not. The clones he was fathering would one day be turned against the very Jedi who commanded them. That dark irony would come true years down the line, through an event known as Order 66. When that moment finally arrived, the clones grown from Django's Mandalorian genes turned on the Jedi and brought about the downfall of their entire order. In a strange way, it was a final act of Mandalorian payback from beyond the grave, aimed at the Force users who had broken the true Mandalorians all those years before. For a long time, the clone army stayed one of the best-kept secrets in the galaxy. That secret finally cracked open when the Jedi Obi-Wan Kenobi started looking into an attempt on the life of a senator named Padme Amidala. Kenobi followed the trail of a very unusual poison dart all the way back to the world of Kamino. What he found there stopped him cold. Kenobi discovered the huge clone army being grown from Django's template, and he came face to face with Django himself. The two of them fought a fierce duel, which spilled over into a tense chase between their ships as Django and his son Boba made a run for the planet Geonosis. On Geonosis, Django met up with his employer Dooku right as two huge powers, the Separatist Confederacy and the Republic, were squaring off for a battle that was about to plunge the entire galaxy into war. That battle would become the opening shot of the Clone Wars, around 22 years before the Battle of Yavin. When the Battle of Geonosis broke out, Django threw himself into the fighting in the arena, standing with the Separatist side. But things went wrong for him fast. A massive charging beast called a Reek slammed into him and trampled him, wrecking his jetpack in the process. Suddenly, the great Django Fett was stuck on the ground with no way to fly off to safety. And that is where his story ended. Out in the open, with nowhere to run, Django Fett met his end at the hands of the Jedi Master Mace Windu. Standing nearby, the young Boba Fett watched his father fall. It was an image that would burn itself into the boy's mind and shape the entire rest of his life. Django's end at Geonosis was the moment Mandalorian history collided head-on with the main story of the galaxy. A single Mandalorian's genes now made up the army that would fight the whole Clone Wars and, in time, bring down the Jedi. There is a painful echo in what happened to Boba that day. Just like Django had been left an orphan back on Concord Dawn as a child, Boba was now orphaned at Geonosis, watching the most important person in his life taken from him. The boy swore he would get his revenge on Mace Windu, and he set off down his own road, one that would eventually lead him to become the most notorious bounty hunter the galaxy had ever known. In those early days, Boba teamed up with other bounty hunters like Aura Singh and Bosk as he tried to avenge his father. Working alongside them, he learned the cold, ruthless trade that would one day make the name Boba Fett mean bounty hunter to the entire galaxy. So Jango Fett left behind a legacy that branched off in 3 different directions. There was the grand army of clones grown from his genes. There was his warrior son Boba, who carried the Fett name forward. And there was the lasting link that would forever tie the Mandalorians to the idea of the deadliest fighters in the galaxy. While Jango and Boba lived out their lives as bounty hunters, the Mandalorian homeworld itself was still trapped in that same old struggle we have followed for so long, the fight between the way of peace and the way of the warrior. And that struggle was about to blow wide open all over again during the Clone Wars. Back on Mandalore, the peaceful new Mandalorians were being led by a noble duchess who wanted nothing more than to end the cycle of fighting for good. But down in the shadows, the leftover pieces of the Death Watch were quietly scheming to drag their people right back into war. The Clone Wars were about to throw 3 forces into one violent collision over the throne of Mandalore. There was the grand experiment of the peaceful new Mandalorians. There was the revived and dangerous Death Watch. And there was the cold, patient plotting of a Sith Lord who was hungry for revenge. By this point, the 2 most famous Mandalorians alive had never once crossed paths. One of them had walked away from his people for good. The other was about to risk everything to set them free. With the Galactic Republic gone and Emperor Palpatine's galactic empire rising in its place, dark times were coming for the Mandalorian people. This was the same Sith Lord the galaxy had once known as Darth Sidious, now ruling openly from the throne. The Mandalorians were already battered from the Clone Wars and still reeling from the loss of Duchess Satine, and now they found themselves squarely in the Empire's sights. The Empire wanted Mandalore badly. It valued the planet's strategic location, and it valued its famous warriors and resources just as much. So the Empire moved to bring the proud Mandalorian culture under its thumb. Palpatine handed the job to an overseer whose task was to crush the Mandalorian population and put them to work as forced labor. Imperial forces set up garrisons across the planet and clamped down with a harsh occupation, reducing many proud Mandalorians to little more than prisoners. But these were Mandalorians, and they were never going to take this lying down. The Mandalorian Protectors, the warrior order that had made it through the Clone Wars under Fen Shaisa, were branded as outlaws by the Empire. In turn, they launched a guerrilla resistance, striking at the occupiers wherever they could. With Fen Shaisa leading them, the Protectors went after Imperial convoys that were hauling away captured Mandalorians. Every time they freed their people, those freed Mandalorians eagerly grabbed weapons and joined the fight, and the resistance kept growing larger and stronger by the day. Now is a good time to talk about who Fen Shaisa really was. He came from the largest continent on Mandalore, and he had grown up side by side with his lifelong friend, a man named Tabi Dala. Before all the wars, The two of them had served together as local constables, keeping the peace in their corner of the world. Now they had become the beating heart of the resistance against the Empire. Together, they carried the unbroken warrior spirit of the old clans against an enemy far more powerful than anything the Mandalorians had faced in centuries. While all of this was unfolding back home, the other famous Mandalorian of the age was carving out a very different kind of legend. Boba Fett, the unaltered clone son of Jango, had grown into the most feared bounty hunter in the entire galaxy. His customized Mandalorian armor and his ship, the Slave One, struck fear across the criminal underworld wherever they turned up. Boba took jobs from just about everyone, working for the Empire one day and the criminal underworld the next. He became a living legend, a hunter whose skill and refusal to ever fail made him the one name that every crime lord and Imperial officer wanted on their side. His single most famous job came during the Galactic Civil War, the great fight between the Empire and the Rebellion. Darth Vader hired Boba to track down a ship called the Millennium Falcon. That hunt ended with Boba helping to capture a man named Han Solo, who was frozen solid inside a block of carbonite on a place called Cloud City. It was the kind of job that locked in Boba Fett's name as the deadliest hunter in the galaxy. But here is the key difference between these two Mandalorians. Even though Boba carried the heritage of Clan Fett in his armor and in his very genes, he had grown distant from the Mandalorian people themselves. He lived as a lone hunter with no interest at all in leading clans or fighting for a homeworld. Fen Shaisa and his Mandalorian protectors were the complete opposite. They were fighting for the survival and the freedom of their entire people. Every so often, they took on outside threats too. By some accounts, they even went up against a warlord called Shadow Spawn at a clash known as the Battle of Mindor. The fight to free Mandalore from the Empire was long, and it was costly. Shaisa's resistance kept up a determined campaign against the Imperial garrison and the overseer who was holding their people in chains. For a long stretch, it looked like it might never end. Then the bigger war started to swing the other way. As the Galactic Civil War began turning against the Empire, Shaisa's fighters finally got the help they had been so desperate for. With support from Princess Leia Organa and the broader rebellion, the Mandalorians were able to land a decisive blow against the Imperial occupation. The combined force of Mandalorian warriors and rebel allies smashed the Imperial stronghold and defeated the Imperial command on the planet. At long last, the Empire's grip on the Mandalorian homeworld was broken. But that freedom did not come for free. In the struggle to bring down the Imperial overlord, Toby Dala, Shaisa's lifelong friend and fellow constable, was lost. For Fen Shaisa, it was a wound that cut as deep as any he had ever suffered. Shaisa buried his friend in an unmarked grave out in the Mandalorian jungle. He set Toby Dala's Super Commando helmet on top of a stake at the head of the mound, a quiet marker for a fallen brother, as the long fight for freedom finally came to its end. With the Empire driven off, Fen Shaisa took up the title of Mandalore for himself. He would be remembered as Mandalore the Avenger, and he took control of the Mandalore system along with other Mandalorian worlds. Under his leadership, the title of Mandalore became a symbol of hope once again, restoring some real unity and pride to a people who had suffered so much under the Empire. Shaisa kept the Mandalorian protectors true to their honorable mission. They would still take on mercenary work now and then, but only under one firm rule. No innocent person was ever to be harmed. It was a clear echo of the Super Commando Codex that Jaster Mareel had written down so long ago. So the Imperial era left the Mandalorians with two very different legacies running side by side. One was Boba Fett, the solitary mercenary and the deadliest hunter in the galaxy. The other was Fen Shaisa, the leader who had fought to free his people and now worked to hold them together. These two paths were bound to cross eventually. Fen Shaisa was growing old, and he carried the title of Mandalore, while the most famous Mandalorian alive was a lone bounty hunter who wanted nothing to do with leading anyone. Something had to give. That crossing point would finally come on a faraway world, and when it did, it would pull Boba Fett back toward the heritage of his father and his people at last. Around 21 years after the Battle of Yavin, on a planet called Shogun, Fen Shaisa fought his last battle. And in his final moments, he would hand the mantle of Mandalore to the one Mandalorian whose name the whole galaxy already feared. Shaisa's passing would close the book on an era of Mandalorian leaders focused purely on defending the homeland. And it would open a strange new chapter, the unlikely reign of Boba Fett as the Lord of all Mandalorians. The reluctant bounty hunter, a man who had spent his entire life as a loner for hire, was about to inherit responsibility for an entire people. And the timing could not possibly have been worse. Because at the very moment Boba Fett took up the mantle of Mandalore, a terrifying new enemy was descending on the galaxy from somewhere far beyond it. They were called the Yuuzhan Vong, and they were about to bring the Mandalorian homeworld a kind of suffering it had never known before. Boba Fett had spent his whole life looking out for no one but himself. That was about to change on a distant battlefield, in the final moments of a warrior he could not save. The year was around 21 years after the Battle of Yavin, and the place was a planet called Shogun. The aging Fen Shaisa was fighting there, and in the heat of the battle, he was struck with a wound that could not be healed while saving Boba Fett's life. There was no pulling him back from it this time. With the last of his strength, Shaisa begged Boba to do one thing for him. He asked Boba to take up the title of Mandalore. It was a heavy thing to ask of a man who had spent decades as a loner. But Boba Fett honored that final wish. He set down the bounty hunter's life he had lived for so long, and he rose up to lead both the Mandalorian protectors and the Mandalorian people as a whole. Boba's reign brought a real change to what it meant to be Mandalore. Instead of using the protectors only to defend Mandalore at home, he started directing them more and more as a professional fighting force for hire, taking on work that served Mandalorian interests all across the galaxy. Then, around 25 years after the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy faced something it had never seen before. An enemy from beyond the known galaxy arrived, and they were called the Yuuzhan Vong. These were unlike any foe in Mandalorian history. They used living organisms as their technology instead of machines, and they held a deep religious hatred for the Force itself. When they launched their invasion, it ripped across the known galaxy at a terrifying speed. The Yuuzhan Vong knew real warriors when they saw them, and they wanted the Mandalorians on their side. They came offering enormous sums of money for Mandalorian help in their war against the New Republic, the government that ran the galaxy in those days. This is where Boba Fett's mind for strategy really showed itself. He pretended to take the deal. On the surface, he allied the Mandalorians with the invaders and pocketed the Vong's credits, making it look like a simple arrangement to keep Mandalorian space safe from their attacks. A Yuuzhan Vong advance scout, a sneaky infiltrator named Nom Anor, who went by the false name Udalin, came to Mandalore in person to make the deal with Boba and to size up the warrior culture for the taking. But Boba never trusted the Vong for a single second. Deep down, he was certain they would break their word the moment it suited them. So in secret, he ordered the Mandalorian protectors to spy on the invaders and quietly feed everything they learned back to the New Republic. He was playing a very dangerous double game. To get his warriors ready for the hard fight he knew was coming, Boba put the protectors through a punishing training program on a junk-covered world called Raxus Prime. The training was so harsh that many of them did not survive it. But the ones who made it through came out the other side as truly elite fighters. Eventually, the Yuuzhan Vong figured out exactly what Boba had been doing. They learned about the double dealing and the spying for the New Republic, and they hit back hard. They turned all of their fury directly on Mandalore itself. The bombardment that followed was devastating. The attack took the lives of roughly a third of the planet's already shrunken population before the Mandalorian protectors, fighting with everything they had, finally managed to drive the invaders off. And here is where the story comes full circle in the most fitting way possible. That same Vong bombardment that scarred Mandalore so badly also cracked open the ground and revealed something buried deep beneath the surface. It uncovered a massive deposit of Beskar, the Mandalorian iron we talked about all the way back at the very beginning of this story. This was the legendary, near-unbreakable metal that had made Mandalorian armor feared across the galaxy for thousands of years. In a strange twist of irony, the very attack meant to break the Mandalorians ended up making them stronger. That rediscovered Beskar gave them fresh access to the material that had defined their warrior identity since the dawn of their people. Even the Yuuzhan Vong assault, as terrible as it was, ended up arming them for whatever came next. But the immediate situation was grim. With a full third of the population gone and the homeworld in ruins, Boba Fett took action to save his people. He put out a call for 2 million Mandalorians living scattered across the galaxy to come back home to Mandalore and help rebuild. He declared Mandalore neutral in the galaxy's ongoing wars, and in a move that surprised many, he gave away a chunk of his own considerable fortune to help restore the homeworld. For a man who had spent his whole life as a loner, it showed a real and unexpected devotion to his people. By around 40 years after the Battle of Yavin, a lot of the damage the Vong had done was finally healing. The fallen on both sides had been laid to rest, and most of the buildings had been repaired. Still, the scars had not fully faded from the capital city of Kelda Bay. The headquarters tower of a company called Mandal Motors, right in the heart of Kelda Bay, still carried the marks of battle. The woodland around the capital had been flattened, and the farmland had been poisoned by the Vong, leaving the Mandalorians struggling with serious food shortages and a smaller population than before. To deal with all of these problems, the clan chieftains and the business leaders of Mandalore gathered together at Mandal Motors Hall under the leadership of Mandalore Boba Fett. There, Fett backed the plan to bring the off-world Mandalorians home and rebuild their numbers. By the time of a conflict called the Second Galactic Civil War, in that same legacy era around 40 years after the Battle of Yavin, Boba Fett had become an old man, and his health was finally starting to fail him. But he kept right on leading his people anyway. In these later years of his life, Boba made a discovery that meant the world to him. He found out that he had a granddaughter named Mirta Gev. The two of them took on many missions together, and at one point they even ended up working alongside the family of Han Solo, the same man Boba had once hunted down all those years before. Mirta Gev was something important. She carried the Fett line and the whole Mandalorian heritage forward into a brand new generation. Through her, Clan Fett lived on, the same family that had given the galaxy Jango and Boba, along with the army of clones that changed the course of history. All through the Legacy era, the Mandalorians held on to their identity as a distinct warrior people. They came together and split apart over and over again, exactly as they had done for thousands of years. But they never once disappeared. They had survived everything the galaxy could possibly throw at them. And that, in the end, is the real heart of the entire Mandalorian story. Their endurance across more than 7,000 years stands as one of the greatest survival stories the galaxy has ever known. Think about how far they had come, from the exiled Tong who were once driven off Coruscant, all the way to the many species who made up the warrior clans of the Legacy era. Time and time again, the Mandalorians stared total destruction right in the face. They faced it at Malachor V, and they faced it again during the Excision. They faced it under the boot of the Empire, and they faced it once more against the Yuuzhan Vong. And every single time they pulled themselves back together around the same handful of things that made them who they were. There was the armor they wore and the language they spoke. There was the creed they lived by, and there was the mask of Mandalore that bound them all under a single leader. This is what their whole history proved. The Mandalorian was never really about being one particular species. It was about an idea. It was a code built on honor and family, and on the willingness to fight for both, something that any worthy warrior from any world could pick up and carry. That is exactly why the Mandalorians managed to outlast even the loss of their own founding people. From the day Mandalore I conquered a world crawling with mythosaurs, all the way to the day Boba Fett stubbornly rebuilt his people after the Vong, the Mandalorians always ended up right back where they started. They were exactly what they had always been, the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy. That mythosaur skull they had carried since the very dawn of their history still sat proudly on their banners. It was the mark of a people who had brought down monsters and conquered entire worlds. They had both served and defied the Sith and the Jedi, and across 7,000 long years, they had refused to ever truly be conquered. And maybe that is the truest lesson the Mandalorians ever taught the galaxy. A warrior culture can never really be destroyed, not as long as a single Mandalorian is still out there, ready to put on the armor and answer the call of the Mandalore. And that, far more than any conquest or any crown, is the true and entire story of the Mandalorians.